Hello, everyone. My name is Call, and I'm a somatic therapist as well as an astrological counselor. And I also help individuals, couples, etc., along their sexual journeys. So, what I want to talk about today is I want to talk about Aquarius and its sexual superpower. Um, Aquarius was really interesting to kind of go into because in order to understand Aquarius, you had to kind of start to really focus on understanding um, I guess, the connection between the individual and what is um, in the social, I guess, and what's social and what's universal. So now the individual can be kind of categorized in a couple of different ways, as well as the social can be categorized in a couple of different ways. Now, the one thing about Aquarius is always inherently social. One way or another, they're always inherently social. It's a bit like the the magnetic aspect of who we are. In other words, what we pull into our lives, what we attract into our lives. In the case of Aquarius, it represents, you have to remember, this represents the polarity to Leo. Now, Leo makes themselves the magnet of attraction, right? So now Aquarius is different. The foci or the focus of attraction is actually outside of Aquarius. So meaning their attentional focus is directed outside of themselves. Now, this is problematic when again, going to this idea, the individual, if the individual is defined by their personality or their ego, the lower self, this can be very messy. Because there's a very diffuse sense of identity here. So now, what does this mean sexually speaking? Well, this very diffuse sense of identity could lead to a lot of really interesting manifestations, and you could get anything from like confusion about one's gender. You could get confusion about one's sexual expression in life. Um, Again, the words here are confusion. You could get even confusion around whether to have sex or not. So you could get someone who could be on the tend to be kind of cold or aloof. Um, you could get someone who's sexually very indiscriminate, who has sex with all sorts of folks because they got it in their mind that in order to be liberated or rebellious, they have to have tons of sex. Uh, Again, because part of Aquarius is also because they are focused on the social dynamic, they're also kind of, I don't want to call them negative. Uh, there might be a tendency to be a flaw finder, let's say that. They can look at society and culture around them and find what's inherently wrong and or what is not working, let's say. I won't say wrong or right. We'll say they can perceive what is not working. So to some degree, this goes a long way in sort of, again, the immature Aquarius in how they're starting to learn to identify or to construct their ego. I guess I never realized that this particular placement was so had such a sort of weak ego. Um, but when you kind of again think about it along the terms of polarities and realize that Leo being, like I said, the other side of this particular polarity, you start to realize that this is kind of how it works in a lot of ways. At least this is the sort of natural rhythm of things. So again, going back to what happens to immature Aquarius as they start to try to define themselves as people and as sexual beings. Um, Immature Aquarius has to deal with a number of factors. They're dealing with the desires of the body, the desires of the mind, and the desires of one's emotional self. And so they're, in a lot of ways, they're kind of hovering above all this stuff. So, and they're functioning from a very, very sort of, it's an air sign. Keep that in mind. It's a fixed air sign. So they're operating from sort of uh, um, again, this sort of detached place. It's airy. It's I don't want to use the term airhead. I don't want to use that term because it gets misinterpreted, and I don't mean like these folks are unintelligent. There's definitely intelligence here, but sometimes it needs to be cultivated at first. So keeping in mind that one of the at least traditional rulerships of Aquarius is Saturn. So part of this having this external magnetic pole what ends up happening with these individuals is that life will kind of attract to them pain, fear, and suffering, mistakes, confusion. Things just don't work out. So in a lot of ways, what this ends up doing is that they start to learn, right? Because this is not an unintelligent sign, and they have the capacity for objectivity and self-reflection. Um, again, if they don't get anchored into all this false individuality, and what do I mean by that? False individuality, as I perceive it, what you see here is you see a superficial aspect of the personality that tries to express itself in unique ways. So here's a good example. Let's say somebody who gets tons and tons of tattoos, tons and tons of piercings, because they figure if I augment my exterior, that will make me individual and different. But the reality is it doesn't, right? What makes somebody ultimately individual and different is what Aquarius ultimately transforms into over time. And that has to do with what we express, the impact we make on the lives of others, and in the domino effect that creates, throughout the course of humanity, human history, et cetera, moving forward. Aquarius is very much like a bridge to what's coming next. Keeping in mind that the current age that we've moved into is the Aquarian age. So what we're seeing is an augmenting or a changing of the social dynamics. Aquarius has the ability to sort of look back and to see what didn't work and to synthesize new social ways of being. And in this current age, again, because Aquarius and the planet Uranus which rules Aquarius in more contemporary times, is related to technology and all those sorts of things. So humanity is changing how we organize ourselves through utilizing technology and and ultimately utilizing universal principles as they apply to technology. It may take us a while to get to the point where we learn about how to bring. I don't want to use the term God, because I know some people get all like fussy about God. God works for me, but we could say the universe, infinity, whatever you want to call it, right? So that aspect, which is universal in myself and is universal in all you, that consciousness itself, this is what Aquarius is recognizing, learning to recognize, is the ability to see that universal aspect and how that universal aspect um, can be organized in some ways into new social forms and structures. So again, going back to immature Aquarius, you're going to get the rebels here, right? You get folks who could potentially be highly self-righteous, lots of self-righteousness here, and potentially. And the other thing you get here is a bunch of followers, right? Because again, when you learn to identify with a social group as your identity, your core identity, it's problematic, right? So you could get people joining cults. And again, this could get really weird sexually if somebody's like, becomes overly identified with a lifestyle, a kink, or, again, some sort of sexual cult. Fascinating the number of possibilities here with immature Aquarius. Now, so as Aquarius gets more mature, let's talk a little bit about what happens, right? So what ends up happening is all this learning that happened in terms of like what didn't work earlier on. So again, keeping in mind that Saturn has a traditional rulership here. So what Saturn does is it eventually, again, through that path of pain, fear, and suffering, the Aquarians are going to get to a point where like something's not working here, right? Nothing. It doesn't matter how many tattoos and piercings I get. It doesn't matter how much I yell and scream about social justice or progressive ideas, or I join this group or that religion and this religion or whatever it may be. The outcome is the same. They're still confused, right? You can hide behind ideologies. Actually, a lot of people hide behind ideologies their entire life, and it never satisfies them. So what the cultivated Aquarius does here is they go, whoa, slow down. So a lot of Aquarians I know, they start to meditate, they start to do yoga, they start to identify with groups that I would consider more healing in nature. and they can start to see how we indeed shine from the inside out, right? So that externalized magnetic aspect of self then starts to become more integrated within oneself. So going back to the idea of individuality, so the false individuality of the ego starts to break down. And as it starts to break down, it starts to identify with the aspects that are more universal in nature. And so the process of individuation, which is ultimately ruled by Uranus, like I said, it initially forces a rebellion so you can recognize, I guess, the separateness, so that you can then reemerge as an individual in that sort of more universal sense. Like I can see the consciousness in you that is universal in everybody, and that it's in me, the same consciousness and the same energy and the same life force that moves through me. When you can recognize that, that is individuation. Once that energy becomes known, I guess, to the ego, the sort of desires of the physical self, the desires of the mental, the desires of the emotional self start to transform. And these desires, once again, start to become externalized. They externalize in a new way, though, right? So because a lot of intelligence with this sign, a lot of power of observation with this sign, what they can see is they see all these different aspects of how humanity was organizing and doing horrible things to each other and whatever, and they want to change it. So they can synthesize what worked and what didn't work, and they can create. And again, this is kind of like intuition, right? So these folks become more and more intuitive. So let me use an example. So Mercury, which Uranus is a higher vibration of Mercury, essentially. So Mercury, what you have is you got duality. You have these polarities, right? So you try to find harmony through conflict. So it's the two polarities, and so like Gemini, for instance, will sit there and go back and forth between the polarities in order to understand them, and eventually they will merge them and find a harmonious point. Now it's different with Aquarius because Aquarius, is functioning through Uranus. And because Uranus, what it does is it sees all these points, and it's seeing the polarities, but it's also seeing those kind of like polarities over time. It's seeing the polarities in a very high-minded, expansive way, only when the Aquarian individual connects to their soul. They connect to their soul, they become a bit like Jupiter, which Jupiter is expansive and high-minded. So if you can think about it, you can see all the polarities, what worked and what it didn't work. And you have Jupiter's high-mindedness can kind of like sort of form an umbrella around everything and say, okay, let's sort this out, let's organize it, and we're going to create this whole new social form and structure. So now, sexually speaking, what does this mean? So sexually speaking, what I can see happening here is, let's say the individual was kind of cold and aloof before because of the confusion and uncertainty. So they're like, all right, I'm not going to have any sex, because that's one of the expressions. It could be total incredible deviance and indulgence and all sorts of kinks and things, or it could be cold. That's how the immature Aquarius could be. Now, how mature Aquarius can be is that once again, this idea of you can see what worked and what didn't work. And again, because these individuals are about the other, it's about right human relations. So sexually speaking, right human relations means what? These folks can eventually sort of evolve into being incredibly open, incredibly accepting, incredibly inclusive to others' sexual expressions. Now, in terms of their own personal self-expression, again, it could become very creative, very experimental, and they know what harms themselves and harms others. Because, again, immature Aquarius kind of can sometimes have a sociopathic kind of like disposition in some ways. And so what ends up happening is that sociopathic aspect is basically exploded, it blows up, and then they start to learn about the service to others aspect. So even in all their sort of sexual relations, even though it may be between themselves and another individual, what it could happen here is and I remember reading this about Venus in Aquarius. People who have Venus in Aquarius, I remember one astrologer I was reading said it's about letting their freak flag fly. So the freak flag, so a lot of that kinkiness and that sort of creative aspect of one's sexuality that existed before can translate here into more sort of healthy expressions. So someone who wants to explore tantra, wants to explore spiritual sex, wants to explore all those things, and eventually this could turn into, if the person is that motivated by sex and sexuality, it could turn into like, let's say somebody who teaches others about unity. How is it that sex is in essence a unifying principle, which then, as a metaphor, relates to sort of how all creation ultimately has this kind of unifying tendency. Again, the sort of all is one principle can then play out as a sexual expression. So eventually, like I said, Aquarius turns into this sort of world server here. So you get all sorts of amazing dynamics of what can possibly manifest. Um, and again, like I said, the highest expression of the superpower here of Aquarius is the world server, the teacher, the bringing about the highest expression of sexuality, sexual acceptance, sexual expression, and how the kinds of again, it's the kinds of sexual expression that don't isolate the individual from the whole. So again, we're talking about tantra, we're talking about um, forming groups and organizations, for instance, that help unify people. So and it's a bit difficult to see how this would work because, again, remember, this is an entirely creative, innovative possibility here. So I feel there are ways in which Aquarius could express their sexuality and sexual expression into off into future times that I certainly can't see coming. So with all that said, uh, hopefully you understand. Hopefully this video kind of made sense. There's kind of a lot of ambiguity here with Aquarius, but hopefully I kind of helped make it somewhat clear. So with all that said, appreciate you watching the video. Thank you.